All right, well, welcome everybody back to the Department of Anthropology Colloquium Series here at the University of New Mexico. I'm really excited for today's speaker, Dr. Amy Liu. But before I introduce Dr. Liu, I want to say that UNM is located on the traditional land of the Pueblo of Sandia. The land holds deep historical, spiritual, and personal significance for New Mexico's indigenous peoples. We acknowledge their connection to the land and are very grateful for the opportunity to live and work and learn here. So Dr. Amy Liu, a friend of mine, Dr. Amy Liu is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Stony Brook University on beautiful Long Island, New York. Her research primarily focuses on female reproductive strategies and offspring development, focusing on wild primates. She co-directs the Simien Mountains Gelada Research Project in Ethiopia, where her current NSF-funded research explores how variable weaning strategies influence offspring growth and immunity in wild geladas. She graduated from the Interdepartmental Doctoral Program in Anthropological Sciences at Stony Brook University in 2009. She then spent 3 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan and University of Illinois. And she joined the faculty at the Department of Anthropology at Stony Brook in 2014. Amy, I should mention, was requested by several people here at UNM as a speaker for this semester. So I know there's a lot of excitement to hear your talk today, Amy. So thank you very much for joining us.
I'm flattered. That introduction makes me feel really old, Ian. Yeah, I probably am now. Okay, let me clear my, move things around on the screen. Is that good for everybody?
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. All right, so thank you for having me here today. I'm pretty excited to share some of this research with you guys. So the talk that I'm giving today focuses on data that's literally been brewing for over a decade. And so what I'm going to focus on today are these male takeovers, which essentially are male immigration events in the species that I study, wild geladas, and how we've learned that they serve as kind of a stimulus that influences some aspects of development for these guys, which is kind of unusual, and as far as I know, hasn't really been documented in a wild primate or in very many wild mammals. And so I'm going to talk about how these takeovers can accelerate female reproductive maturation and potentially age at weaning in wild geladas. So some of this data we published in the last year, and some of this we're currently working on. Let's see. Okay, so I wanted to start by talking about, how as individuals or researchers that study primates and humans, we're really interested in how the social environment influences fitness, right? And that kind of plays out in multiple different ways. So we can think about how intrasexual competition influences fitness, right? So these are kind of your classic socio-ecological ideas about how things like female dominance rank or the number of competitors in a group influence how much food you get, and as a consequence influence, your reproductive rate, things like that. We can also think about, how much social support you have. So there's a lot of emerging evidence in the last, decade or two about how, bondedness and social integration really can influence things like longevity, which can also influence fitness, particularly in long-lived species. And finally, there's this third category, which is sexual conflict. And sexual conflict is when the fitness interests of males and females kind of collide, right? Because potentially what benefits fitness for females may not benefit fitness the most for males, and vice versa. And probably the most extreme example of sexual conflict is sexually selected infanticide, where a male, usually a new male, immigrates into a group or becomes high-ranking, becomes a breeding male. And, it's in his best interest to mate with females as soon as possible. And yet there's some females that are unable to conceive at the time because they're lactating or pregnant. And this kind of creates this conflict because you see sexually selected infanticide where males kill infants. And this has, been well documented in primates and other animals like lions. And so there's this obviously extreme conflict of interest. And that has clear ramifications for the fitness of both males and females. And a lot of that has been, studied in the last few decades as well. So in all, these social factors, intersexual competition, bonds, sexual conflict, we know that they can affect fitness for adults, right? And I'm going to focus on females here. So for an adult female primate, we know that things like rank, we know that things like group size, things like sexual conflict, they're going to influence how likely your offspring are to survive, how much food you get, your birth rate, etc. There's also evidence for a number of these social factors that they influence the pace of development for young primates. So for instance, dominance rank, group size can maybe influence the timing of reproductive maturation. They can influence potentially how fast infants gain independence as well, or get weaned. And so what I'm going to focus on today are two aspects of this kind of developmental or life trajectory here. I'm going to focus on weaning and reproductive maturation, kind of two milestones of development. And I'm really going to look at things a little bit differently in the sense that I'm going to see how sexual conflict, this conflict that plays out between males and females, can actually have an impact at younger ages. So not just during adult life, but during these earlier ages. And I'm going to tell the story the way it unfolded, because I think, as far as geladas go, they've really told us what we should go and research, right? We might hash the best plans, but then we go to the field and something weird happens and we're like, oh, we gotta look at that. So for those of you that don't know what geladas look like or what they're about, this is a female gelada. So geladas are Cercopithecine primates. They're endemic to the Ethiopian highlands. They're closely related to baboons, and so they share some social features with baboons. And the primary one being that females form matrilineal social hierarchies where daughters rank below moms, and families rank above other families. They are also unique in that their diet focuses on grass, although I'm not really going to talk about that today, but we have some data showing that they have specialized gut microbial adaptations to grass, etc. But what I'm really interested in is in the gelada social system. Okay, so geladas live in these what we call one male reproductive units, and we say they're one male, but they're not always one male. Sometimes there's a follower male or two. But those follower males effectively have no breeding opportunities. Sometimes they get about 10%, but a lot of times a follower male is the former leader and he's not mating at all. And so what this means is that effectively the breeding system is one male, it's a closed breeding system. And outside of those units, there are these bachelor groups, right? Because males that mature, they have to have somewhere to go. And those bachelor groups are kind of lurking in the environment. They're around more some parts of the year relative to others. But the key thing is that those males in those bachelor groups, they have to challenge an existing leader male, a reproductive male, depose him to gain any reproductive opportunities. And this creates this perfect storm for something like sexually selected infanticide in lots of sexual conflict. And as you might expect, in the context of a takeover within the first 3 months, depending on what year we've looked at it, I have 35% of infants are lost to infanticide. It can go up to 40, 50%. But the point being is that the likelihood of infant death goes up almost 30 times during this immediate aftermath. So in 2011, sort of when I first joined the Gelada Project, kind of kicking and screaming at the time, we were hearing reports of females, juvenile females showing signs of reproductive maturation in the field, kind of synchronously with takeovers. So here's two females in our N group. You can see that they can have these like puffy plastic looking chest swellings. And for geladas, unlike other primates where you've probably heard about sex skin swellings, given that there are a numerous, at least two of you who study chimps here. So geladas have sex skin swellings around the perineum as well, so around the butt region. But the most conspicuous thing that we see out there are these swellings on the chest, which are pretty unique for them. And Adult females, their chest swellings are actually kind of different. They develop these beads around that hairless patch of skin there. But young females who first mature, they have this very distinctive puffy looking chest patch. Okay, so we know that that's the first sign that they are going through reproductive maturation. It's also at the same time where their estrogen concentrations go up. So we're seeing this, and these reports, kind of made us scratch our heads and is this something that we've seen in other animals? Is this a possibility? How do we actually go about and study this? And so when you dig into the literature on reproductive maturation, it's kind of ripe with studies that look at how ecological factors and social factors influence the pace of maturation via nutrition, right? So like how many competitors there are, what's your social rank, right? And how that influences how much food you get. And then if you get a lot of food, you grow faster, you mature sooner. And we think that, in terms of fitness, this is supposed to increase your lifetime reproductive success by accelerating your reproductive career. We now know that that's probably exaggerated because, for long-lived species, fitness depends a lot on longevity. And if you mature earlier, you might also die sooner. But nevertheless, there might be this slight advantage. Now, there are also a number of studies, or a handful, I should say, that look at direct social factors and how that influences the timing or pace of maturation. And so you have these studies on cooperative breeding females where, you've got a dominant female, like in marmosets and tamarins, that effectively suppress subordinate females. And this is thought to be an opportune timing thing. So, in cooperative breeding systems, there's only one female who is breeding at a time. And at least in marmosets, they've shown that females who escape this reproductive suppression, they get their infants killed, right? So, reproducing while an existing breeding female is still present may not be the best strategy, right? So it kind of sort of benefits them to suppress at the time. If we look for male factors, though, you really have to go to the 1960s, where John Vandenbergh did a bunch of experiments on mice and showed that the introduction of novel males to juvenile female mice could accelerate maturation. So he did these experiments where he would expose a female to a novel male at like 21 days, 28 days, 35 days, 48 days, etc. And he found that he could push maturation earlier and earlier and earlier, at least up to 21 days. Presumably, there is a threshold at which you shouldn't be able to push this anymore. But as far as I know, there weren't any studies that looked at that. And this, from a fitness perspective, is thought to also be about opportune timing, because, it doesn't really benefit a female to invest in reproduction until there's an available male, right? And that available male should be an unrelated individual, which might be cued in by novelty. And so there was some possibility that this was going on. And if we cast our lens a little wider, this Vandenbergh effect, as it's called, has been documented in a few species, some domestic pigs and marsupial, also callitrichids. And there's a curious captive study on a population of Hamadryas baboons. And this Hamadryas baboon study really gave some hope because, Hamadryas are closely related to Geladas. They have a very similar mating structure, these closed one male reproductive units. And they're circumpossessing primates who generally are not thought to communicate by acute sensory signals as the Vandenbergh effect is thought to be conveyed. Okay, so the fact that you have this study on Hamadryas baboons, and I just like to show this data because even though it's for animals and it's pretty anecdotal, it was very striking. So what happened was they introduced this new male to a group of Hamadryas baboons, and the 4 existing juvenile females in the group essentially matured within the next 3 months. So you can see time after introduction here. And strikingly, their age at maturation was about, on average, like 1 year earlier than the colony mean. And even though captive primates certainly go through their lives a little quicker, right? They develop faster than wild primates. That 1.87 years of age is like when some geladas, at least a lot of geladas, aren't even weaned yet. So that's a pretty crazy acceleration. So this kind of gave us hope. And another piece of this equation came in 2012 when a team looked at the potential proximate mechanism for the Vandenbergh effect. And this is a really cool study where they injected males with radio-labeled estrogen, and they tried to trace how that estrogen, influenced females. So the hypothesis here is that estrogens, because they're involved in reproduction and maturation, are somehow involved in the Vandenbergh effect, and they wanted to see if it was coming from the male, right? So they injected these radio-labeled estrogens, and they found that those radio-labeled estrogens traveled to females either through an intranasal or a cutaneous route, and it bound to the female reproductive tract, and that initiated maturation. And more interestingly, the same process actually induced the 𝗔 effect. So the 𝗔 effect is something that we had in 2012 just published a paper on as well in Geladas. And the 𝗔 effect is pregnancy termination. So adult females who are pregnant, they terminate their pregnancies or they lose their fetuses. Fetal loss is another term for it, in response to novel males. And this is thought to be a counter strategy to infanticide. So Jacinta Biener likes to call these offspring doomed offspring. So if you're pregnant with a potentially doomed offspring, maybe it is in your best interest to curtail reproductive investment until a better time. So the fact that these were sharing the same mechanism, and we found the 𝗔 effect in Geladas, suggested to us that the Vandenbergh may be possible. So in general, over the years, we found a lot of data supporting the idea that adult female physiology is highly sensitive to new males. So pregnant females in 2012, right? So here we are, a takeover, sexual conflict. We found using hormonally defined pregnancies that the background rate of fetal loss in the population was 1 out of 50, but in a takeover situation, 80% of fetuses were lost, basically the day of the takeover. So this is an example of a hormonal profile where you have fecal estrogens kind of going up like it does with pregnancy, and then at the day of takeover, it just drops the baseline. So the 𝗔 effect, is something that definitely happens in our population. For lactating females, we've been sort of punching at the story or kind of tippy-toeing around the story for a few years now. I think we have the answers pretty soon. But Elizabeth Tinsley Johnson in 2018, part of our seasonality paper, found that takeovers were associated with an increase in lactating females returning to estrus, right? And the idea, so this is an example of what that kind of fertility signal looks like on the chest patch. And so this is thought to be a strategy whereby lactating females can actually say to males, hey, I'm fertile. So even though I have this infant, you don't need to kill this infant because I can mate with you. Whether or not that signal is a false signal of fertility or indicates true maternal divestment, that's something that we're currently investigating. And then for juveniles in 2013, we wrote this review paper and we thought, well, review paper is a great place to dump some data, right? So we published our first little diagram or a little figure showing that as far as we could see in 2013, females were maturing in the first few weeks after a takeover. Now, keep in mind that this is 2013. We had only been following the Geladas for about 7 or 8 years at the time. A lot of these females didn't have known dates of birth, right? So we're strictly looking at timing here, not controlling for anything. So we were pretty convinced in 2013. And then I will confess that as the years progressed, we started getting less and less convinced. And a lot of it is because we started seeing some anecdotal evidence for a father effect. So fathers potentially suppressing female reproductive maturation. And so we were like, well, are they, because some of these maturations were occurring right before a takeover as well. But here we are a decade later, and we thought, well, let's give this a try here and see if we can disentangle these with a lot more data. So the first question we had was, does male-mediated maturation exist, right? Does it exist from a takeover perspective with the novel male? Do dads have the ability to suppress reproductive maturation? What mediates it from a proximate perspective? We weren't really interested in answering whether, it was estrogens coming from the male. We just purely wanted to know if females showed some estrogen response to these takeovers. And then finally, what might be its adaptive value? And I would say the jury's still out on that one, but we're continuing to look at it. Okay, so here is an image of Simien Mountains National Park. Here's a small gelada unit, and you can see that we're really high up. We're looking out over we're on the escarpment looking out down the cliffs, and we're above the clouds, so it's pretty high up there. In terms of where we're located, we are in northern Ethiopia, pretty close to the Eritrea border. So we are very close to a lot of the fighting right now, which I was speaking to Ian earlier and Melissa earlier. We've paused somewhat there for good reason, and we're hoping that things will calm down in a bit. Here are my partners in crime, Jacinta Biener and Tori Bergman, who set up the field site, and then Noah and I, who joined, I guess, as adolescents about a decade ago, maybe. I guess it's been a decade now. It's crazy. So I like to show this map because it kind of highlights the Simien Mountains here, but then also this 𝗭𝗄𝗏 project here. So these are the two gelada projects. So we're not the only ones who study geladas. The main differences between us and the 𝗭𝗏𝗏 project is that we focus more on social questions. They focus more on ecological questions. That's driven really by interest, but also when the 𝗭𝗏𝗏 project says that their field site is more pristine, that is actually accurate, as much as I hate to say it. So our site, it's a national park. We see more tourists. The Geladas also share that grazing environment with lots of domestic animals. Okay, so why are we able to study this in geladas, right? So when you think about takeovers and introductions to novel males at a group level, these are really rare events. But we're able to tackle this question because those reproductive units actually aggregate and form bands of hundreds of individuals. So we can get a band of 10, 20, 30 units. I've seen bands that have 700, 800 individuals. We don't follow them because it's crazy. But what that effectively means, right, is that when you're out on the landscape in a given day, you can look for all the individuals in your 20 units that you're following. You can check if there's a new male there, if infants are present. And so this gives you this kind of unique opportunity to follow. We follow over 20 groups in a given year, and we've been doing this for over a decade. And this allows us to look at something that is relatively rare. So takeovers happen about once every 2 years, but over time, because we study so many units, we can actually amass the sample to address some of these questions. And so here is, I like to show this probably because just to remind myself that geladas are so cool. So coming from studying an arboreal monkey and following one group for 7 days before I have to search for another one and then follow them for 7 days. You go out to Ethiopia, and this is a pretty good morning, but you could see hundreds of geladas, and the screen just keeps going. So, we literally can keep track of all these animals. And you can kind of see there's a unit there. If you can see my mouse, there's a unit here, right? They are kind of segregated, but they're all hanging out together. So the data that I'm going to talk about today span about 15 years from 2006 to 2020. We've included 80 maturations, all with known dates of birth, to look at the timing of maturation and the age at maturation. And then there's a period from 2011 to 2014 during my postdoc years where we collected lots of samples from juvenile females and analyzed them for fecal estrogen metabolites. And fecal estrogens, like I said, we know are indicative of maturation because here is the time of a female's first, that plastic chest swelling that I showed you. And you can see that estrogens are rising right at that time. And just to highlight here that this is a 14-year kind of baby of ours, and it actually includes 3 generations of researchers, although I think if Jacinta heard me call her an older generation of mine, she might kill me. But Jacinta and I conceived of this study really in like 2011, and Jacob Fader, who's my graduate student, has helped us a lot with some of the analyses. So here we go. So does male-mediated maturation exist? It does. So in the sort of 90 days following a takeover, we were kind of following the 𝗵𝗲𝗏𝗏 example here. Females are 3 times more likely to mature, okay? And even though this figure isn't as clean as that figure we showed in 2013, these peaks here that kind of surround that takeover are actually mostly, at least before, females that got close to maturational age with their fathers, when their fathers are the only units and just couldn't hold on, right? So there's a father suppressive effect on the timing of maturation. And so you can see here with the effect sizes here, takeovers have an independent effect on the timing of maturation. Father presence delays maturation. And if you look at the distribution of those maturations, this figure kind of tells you a little bit more what's going on. So here we are, 4.7 years of age is the mean age at maturation. All the green are females where their fathers were present at the earliest age that a female could mature, right? And then in a takeover situation, even the females that had their fathers in the unit matured faster. Here in the non-takeover, they matured slightly later. You can really see it in situations where fathers had already been replaced long before a female was even close to maturational age. So in this case, if there's no takeover, females are maturing kind of close to the mean here. And if there is a takeover, they're maturing a few months earlier. Okay, so we have both. We have this father suppressive effect and a novel male accelerating effect. And I think what's really interesting is that even if a takeover never happens, a female will eventually mature even when her father is the only male in the unit. She just holds on for dear life. So we literally had females that were maturing at 6.5, almost 7 years of age. And this, you know, that's pretty late for a gelada. So this panel is my favorite panel because it was both the most surprising and cool and also the most disturbing result we found. So when we looked at fecal estrogens in these juvenile females, and we looked at juvenile females as young as a year old, what we found was that in the 30 days following a takeover, so for physiology, we decided to make it 30 days because we thought that physiology probably should respond faster than the overall maturational trajectory. We found that regardless of whether or not we were looking at 1-year-old females, 2-year-old females, 3-year-olds, or 4-year-olds, in that month following a takeover, fecal estrogens were higher than baseline. And you see that in individual trajectories too. So here is a female that's about 1, a female that's about 2, and a female that's about 3. And that dotted line is the day of takeover. And you can see that all of these females have responses. Now, what's important to recognize is that only female 1, the one that is 4 years old, close to maturational age, actually matures. These other females just experience these transient rises in estrogens and then they come back down to baseline and nothing happens. What's important about that is that even though every gelada female, regardless of age, responds to takeovers with this estrogen surge, that estrogen surge effectively is only able to bump you over, you know, the edge to become an adult if your body presumably is ready, right? So if you're close to that age. So just to like wrap everything up here, at least in this section, we found that female geladas synchronize maturation in new males, that fathers delay but don't completely suppress maturation. This is potentially mediated by estrogens. We think that this is endogenous, and we think this is probably some sort of more complex cognitive cue in geladas, or they're figuring something out socially. And the big reason why I think that, instead of, you know, sniffing the urine of a novel male, for instance, is that geladas share the landscape, right? Every unit shares the landscape with every other unit. So females are exposed to novel males basically all the time. So there has to be something that happens when a male actually becomes a new leader that's stimulating this response. And finally, because estrogens don't always push females into maturing, a critical developmental threshold is still needed. So then what is the adaptive benefit? From the father suppression perspective, I think it's pretty clear that inbreeding avoidance is at play, although we are currently unable to really examine that, mostly because we just don't see a lot of mating between fathers and offspring. But what about this response to those novel males? So one potential possibility is that this is really about accelerating first birth as fast as possible. So if you experience a takeover and there's a new male and you can mate with him, then go, right? Because the faster you mature, the faster you can start your reproductive career. And, you know, unsurprisingly, as it is with just about every other primate study, the age at maturation is positively correlated with the age at first birth. However, when you actually look at how this translates in terms of an advantage, in terms of how much a takeover actually accelerates maturation, females that experience a takeover only seem to gain a few months, which translates into about a 0.14, I think, offspring advantage over a lifetime. So that's not a big advantage. Alternatively, this could be a timing issue. So the logic behind the timing is that if a juvenile female matures right after a takeover, then maybe she is reducing the risk that when her offspring, her first offspring, you know, is dependent, that they won't also experience another takeover and lose that offspring due to infanticide or the 𝗔H effect or something like that. And so it's sort of an optimal timing fitness benefit. And so in order to look at this, we looked at females of maturational age who experienced a takeover, who matured in those 3 months versus those that did not, to see if the ones that matured gain more time to the next takeover. And it's probably not surprising that they do gain more time, but if you translate this advantage into what's actually going on in a female's life, this means that her infant will be about 1 years old at the time of the next takeover. And that's important because if you look at the likelihood of an infant dying in response to a takeover, relative to the infant age at takeover, the likelihood of dying drops off pretty dramatically at about 1 year of age. Okay, so we think that there's a timing issue here, and that potentially that fitness advantage due to timing is more important than overall acceleration of their reproductive careers. Nevertheless, I think that both of these are fairly modest gains. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, one is 0.14 offspring, the other one is looking at the survival of the first offspring, right? So we're talking about a 0.14 to 1 offspring advantage over a life. And compared to something like the 𝗔H effect, the Vandenbergh effect may not be that beneficial, may not have as dramatic effects on fitness. So when you think about the 𝗔H effect, male-mediated fetal loss, that could be beneficial over and over again in a gelada female's lifetime. A gelada female can experience multiple takeovers over her lifetime. And each of those takeovers, if she has an ability to mediate her investment strategy, then she's at an advantage. And so one part of this equation may be that because the 𝗔H effect and the Vandenbergh effect share a similar mechanism, one might be influencing the other, right? So selection for the 𝗔H effect may be influencing the Vandenbergh effect and vice versa, although we think that probably selection for the 𝗔H effect is a bit strong. Another reason why we think these two are related is because even though there are very few studies that have looked at both effects in the same species, the handful, I think there are 3 that do, they co-occur, okay? So this is an idea that we're hoping that other people can help us figure out by doing, I don't know, by doing some comparative studies and maybe just studying these effects more in other species. Okay, So that was, our kind of like big finding. And once we dealt with the male-mediated effects, we decided to turn to other classic social predictors of maturation. So now that we know that male effects are there, do geladas who also have these matrilineal hierarchies, do they have these sort of classic rank-related influences on maturation or group size influences on maturation? And so the traditional predictions associated with these factors are that if you live in a small group and you have few competitors, and if your mom has a high social rank, then you should accelerate reproductive maturation because presumably, you have advantages in life, you get more food, you're less vulnerable to others, etc. And so we wanted to just see, all right, do we see this in geladas? And we were able to do this with a little bit of a truncated sample size, mostly because we needed to have maternal rank on all these guys, and we didn't in the earliest years. So this is about 51 maturations. So looking at rank and group size and controlling for male effects. And so what we found was kind of a mixed bag. So daughters of high-ranking females did indeed mature faster than daughters of low-ranking females in purple here. We found a unit size effect, but it was opposite to what we predicted. So daughters in larger units actually matured faster than daughters in smaller units. So what's going on here? A feeding ecologist would say this might be intergroup contest competition. So maybe females in larger groups have a feeding advantage because they can displace females in smaller groups for food. We thought this was relatively unlikely because geladas eat grass. So what kind of territory of grass are you displacing, right? But to look at this further, we thought, well, if this was food, then we should see adult females also have an advantage in large groups, and we should see a faster interbirth interval for adult females. And we don't see that. There is no relationship between the number of females in a unit and her interbirth interval. And this is removing anything related to a takeover here. So based on that, and I recognize that, we probably should have someone actually do feeding competition. I don't know when that's going to happen, but based on this, we think that this is not related to intergroup contest. Instead, what we do know is that group size is associated with the likelihood of takeovers. And this is not too crazy of an idea, right? So if there are more females in a unit, it is a more attractive unit to bachelors. And so the likelihood of taking over is just higher. But what's going on here? Because in the model, we controlled for the direct impact of takeovers, and group size had its own independent effect. So this had us scratching our heads for it, right? So on the one hand, we think, okay, there's a possibility this could be a sloppy physiological response on the part of females. So the idea is that large groups are more attractive, so maybe there's bachelors around a bit more, even if they're not taking over the units. And so females are kind of having these poor responses that are timed. It's bad timing, essentially. Alternatively, there's a possibility that the accelerated maturations can be some sort of symptom, I guess, of accelerated development. So if you look at the early life adversity literature, there's this idea that adversity might accelerate your overall developmental pace. We generally thought this was unlikely in geladas, but to investigate it further, we decided, hey, let's give it a shot and let's see if group size influences other aspects of development. And so we turned to weaning. So does group size accelerate weaning? So weaning is difficult in geladas. We measure it in multiple different ways, but the classic way that weaning is measured in Cercopithecines is to actually look at when mothers resume cycling. So looking at from the mom's perspective. Now, this is complicated in geladas because we already know that lactating females time their swellings to when takeovers occur. And so there's a lot of debate over whether these signals are false or whether they're true indicators of accelerated weaning. So we have to take takeovers completely out of the equation, and we have to limit our sample to females that resume cycling or resume their swellings in a completely non-takeover situation. So we looked at that, and we looked at the effective group size on that limited data set, which is still like 100 individuals. And we found, lo and behold, that females do swell earlier in larger groups. So this is stuff that I've been doing with my postdoc, 𝗭𝗶𝗵𝗆, and 𝗭cia𝗵𝗃𝗃, who's actually a graduate student in the University of Michigan. But we know that the infant's age at mom's resumption of cycling is the youngest in large units. And just to be extra sure, we looked at the number of scans where we found moms and infants in nipple contact, or you can sort of think of it as nursing. And when you look at this, nursing clearly drops off as infants get older, but it drops off a lot more dramatically for females in larger groups. So now we have two pieces of evidence that indicate that females in larger groups wean their kids faster. And presumably this means that infants are going through development a bit faster in larger groups. So that's kind of where we are with this group size thing here. So group size effects on maturation and weaning, they could indicate accelerated development. We have some evidence showing that for two life history milestones, but we're still pretty cautious with this interpretation so far, because a mom's resumption of cycling, or her first swelling, her interbirth interval, and nursing, those all suggest that moms are divesting in offspring, but they're not really clean measures necessarily of how fast the kid is actually developing. And so, the next question is, are there any indicators kind of a pure infant development or purer infant development? And so we want to look at our growth data, which we haven't touched in years, and also potentially something like the maturational pace of the infant gut microbiome, which we're currently looking at. Now, the alternative, and it also could be actually occurring at the same time, is that these are sloppy female responses to bachelors that affect both juvenile and lactating females. If this is the case, then we have to have better data on bachelor proximity. And I assume if we did, we could then associate that with female hormonal responses, so estrogen responses. And we probably want to focus on juvenile females because it's cleaner, because they're basically at baseline, and then they have, a surge in estrogen. If we looked at adult females, it's just messier because there's all these reproductive states involved. But that's kind of, I think, what we have to do moving forward. And so this is, pieces of a puzzle we're trying to figure out, right? So group size is related to takeovers. And we now know that both of those affect the pace of weaning, and I might still put that in quotes here, and the pace at maturation. What we don't know is that whether other indicators of sort of pure infant development, such as growth, kind of track the same thing. And what is the relationship between weaning and maturation? Now, we have some indication that the influences of these traits on these two life history milestones are actually independent, because age at weaning actually isn't correlated with age at maturation very well. So that's kind of where we're taking these questions next. Oh, and I just had to throw this in here. So we started playing with the growth data, and although we haven't looked at group size yet, these are females, I believe. These are infant females, and all the little dots there is the sort of background data we have on growth for females. And these are, the month of age is on the x-axis there. So these are all immatures. And what you see here is that individuals that experience takeovers in the first 3 months of life appear to be growing faster. The effect appears to be less strong if we limit it to 6 months of life. And that is the pattern we're seeing. So a lot of the data we're analyzing right now suggests that takeovers have their most dramatic effects the earlier they are, even if the infant survives. Okay, so hopefully I'll have more to say about that in the next few years. And I just wanted to end with this slide. So if this is the life course of a gelada, no matter what factors we decide we're interested in, such as group size and maternal rank or whatever, the answers that we get seem to always bring us back to takeovers. And these events have very dramatic effects on geladas over their life course. So we know that, for infants, they affect infanticide, injury, development, weaning pace, right? For juveniles, we know that juveniles also get injured. And actually, we know, and this is unpublished data, but that all individuals, regardless of age, sex, class, respond to takeovers with a glucocorticoid response. The jury's out right now about whether gestating and lactating females have a stronger response. I think Jacinta's lab is working on that right now, but everybody has a response. Females mature in response to these takeovers. Adult females have developed all these counter strategies to those takeovers. And we think maybe that this is going to affect aging as well, although we're not quite there yet. So that's kind of all I have. And I will go ahead and take questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a wonderful talk. I have a couple questions, but I'll let other people ask questions first if they have them. If you have any questions, just go ahead and turn on your camera and feel free to ask the question.
I have one. My camera isn't working though.
Oh, right. Go ahead, Melissa.
I think you can see. Yeah, you can see that. I'm curious in those larger groups. I don't know how large a large group is, but whether there's more support for mothers, whether there's better care or better protection, if there's less likelihood of infanticide, if there is a takeover.
So the group size takeover relationship is that, you know, if you're in a larger group, you're more likely to be taken over, but the likelihood of infant death is actually high in both large and small units. So large units have about, define it as I think 7 to 10 females, and small units is 2 to 4. And small units, we think what's going on is that, you know, there's essentially no dilution effect, right? So even though takeovers don't happen as frequently, when they do, there's not that many infants to choose from. So potentially, yeah, in large units, there's some protection. So we do see females mob males in those larger groups, but I don't know how effective it actually is.
Thanks.
Martin, go ahead.
Hey, Martin.
Hi. You probably said this, but can you say a little more about? So you showed the curves of estrogen in those young females peaking right after the takeover.
Yeah.
What does that look like in all the adult females?
It looks the same. I think that's. I know it's weird that we looked at the juveniles first, but estrogens and that we didn't run for all the samples, so. I think it's so Jacinta's currently running them in her lab right now. And as far as I know, it looks the same. So all females have a similar physiological response.
So, I mean, maybe you already suggested this, but is it the case that it could be really an adaptation for adult females?
Yeah.
So if you're a female and the male comes in and there's a takeover, if you have a really young infant, you might do one of these fake swellings. If you have an older infant, you might start cycling again and wean it and just quickly and maybe it's just a byproduct of the
So I think that probably the strongest factor here is the Bruce effect. So I think if anything, that's driving things. But there's a 1970 something paper by Thelma Royal where she talks about how these three might be actually interlinked because they were seeing some evidence of this in captivity. So that was all anecdotal and so there's some suggestion of that, and I think that's probably true. I think these are all some sort of correlated mechanism that just plays out slightly differently depending on what part of your life you're in.
And we don't know the mechanism for the Bruce effect in Geladas?
I think it's estrogen, but the Bruce effect is really hard because those infants basically just die the next day. I mean, those fetuses get aborted the next day. So we don't have that right after takeover data. It's very hard to get that before estrogen is just 0. Yeah, but based on the rodent experimental data, I would guess that it's similar.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, this is really good stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and ask my question, or one of my questions. I'm curious if there are any negative consequences. I'm thinking about health to being born to a mother whose maturation was accelerated. Are they is there any sort of like difference in parenting between mothers who have had an accelerated maturation?
I don't know that yet.
Okay.
I don't know that yet. The only thing I can tell you is that, even though age at maturation and first birth are correlated, if you really accelerate maturation, your period of sterility before first birth is actually longer. It's just that when you do the correlation, it just all washes out. You lose some time, but overall you still gain some time. Whether that has a cost, the thing is, I think the accelerated part of the equation, I think it's almost like tangential. I feel like it's really all about timing. And so it really depends if, you experience that takeover at like 3. So the earliest maturing female we've ever seen is 3.5 years of age. So if you happen to experience a takeover right around that time, you will be extremely accelerated, right? You will certainly be accelerated relative to if you don't experience a takeover, right? So I think it ultimately depends on, again, how early that happens. And, it's not necessarily a takeover maturation that has costs. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I'll go ahead and ask my second question real quick. So to what extent do you know, or maybe this is known in other animals too, but to what extent is like this, it seems like the response in the females is like in a derived feature, whatever is going on there, that's a derived feature. But have males evolved some sort of stimulus difference? Like, is it a matter, is the unique feature here the response, or is it the stimulus and the response? Or and I guess the question, I'm thinking, if you knew the answer to that, then maybe it would tell you more about like the evolutionary significance of it. Yeah,
we don't know anything about the male side. Okay. Mostly because we're maybe at that point where we can start looking at male variation. Because there's also, like people have talked about males that will commit infanticide for sure, and males that don't. There's variation in that in some primate populations, right? So getting at, I think, male variation is important, but it's like one male at a time, right? There's the sample sizes are just not going to accumulate fast enough, those males.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions? We're approaching 3 o'clock, I realize. Well, I just want to say that I love seeing pictures of geladas in the highlands of Ethiopia. All those pictures are always breathtaking. So that's a cool place to work.
I just have one more question. Can you say something about what groups are more vulnerable to takeovers, or how males are choosing a group to attempt to
Large
take
groups are. Large groups are. Largest groups are.
And is it anything about the age of the current male, or the senescence of the?
So large groups typically, and so this is just me talking about the data, we haven't analyzed this. So larger groups typically have males that have been there for a while. Like, they're really good males, long tenured, have tons of offspring. They're targeted when they're older. Smaller groups kind of have these crappy small males, and turnovers actually pretty frequent sometimes as well, because they're crappy males. But nevertheless, takeovers are still way more common in larger units.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking Amy again. Amy, that was a really great talk, and it was really, really fun to see those results, and look forward to hearing more in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
You too.
Thanks, Amy.